Hmm, just a nurse's pennies, isn't it, Daniel? My daughter-in-law held up the envelope I'd spent 34 years filling, then let it fall onto the Thanksgiving table like it was a grocery receipt. Her mother laughed first. Then the rest of the table followed. My son said nothing. I picked up my coat, walked out the front door, and drove home in silence. The next morning, I called my attorney. She told me to come in immediately. Hey, quick question, before we go further. Have you ever worked a job that made other people feel superior to you? Drop a comment. I read every single one. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe. Some details here have been shaped for storytelling, but the lesson is completely real. Now, back to what happened after I made that phone call. The Hartwell house sat on 3 acres in Westchester County, the kind of property that showed up in architectural magazines and made guests feel like they'd arrived somewhere important. My daughter-in-law, Vivian, had grown up 40 minutes north in a smaller house with bigger ambitions. She'd married my son, Daniel, 2 years ago in a ceremony that cost more than my first property purchase, which is saying something because I bought that duplex in 1989 for $48,000 and every penny of it was mine. I've been a registered nurse for 34 years. Night shifts, 12-hour rotations, holidays spent in hospital corridors while other families sat around tables like the one I just left. When my colleagues asked why I still worked nights at 62, I told them I liked the quiet. That was half true. The other half was that I'd never stopped being the woman who showed up, who did the work, who understood that a paycheck was the start of something, not the end. Vivian did not share that understanding. I'd known it from the first dinner Daniel brought her home. She had that particular talent of making every room feel like an audition. She was already winning. She asked about my work once, early on, with the kind of smile that suggested she already found the answer beneath her. A nurse. Oh, how essential. And then she moved on to ask Daniel about his promotion. Daniel was an architect. Good at it, genuinely. He'd gotten his firm's biggest contract 2 years before he met Vivienne, and she'd arrived in his life right when his confidence was tallest. I watched her reshape him the way water reshapes stone. Slow, patient, invisible until the damage was done. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, my son called me twice a month instead of twice a week. He'd stopped coming to Sunday dinners. He'd started using phrases I didn't recognize, the kind that sounded like someone else's words wearing his voice. I still came when invited. That's what mothers do. The envelope I brought that evening had taken me 3 decades to prepare. Not the money itself, which was more than they understood, but the habit behind it. Every month since 1989, I'd set aside a portion of every paycheck. Not for retirement, not for a vacation home, for purpose. I'd learned young that the difference between surviving and building was what you did with the money before anyone told you what to do with it. The envelope contained a personal check for $4,000, drawn from one of my smaller accounts, with a handwritten note explaining that it was a contribution toward whatever home they chose to build together. Not their current house, which they rented, but their future. I'd also included a card with a phone number for a financial planner I trusted, someone who'd helped me structure my own portfolio years earlier. It wasn't a flashy gift. It wasn't meant to be. Vivienne opened it at the table in front of her parents, her college friends, and Daniel, who sat at the head with that careful expression he'd been wearing since he married her. She pulled out the check, looked at it, looked at her mother, and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Just a nurse's pennies, isn't it, Daniel? Her mother covered her mouth. The laughter was polite, the kind that tries to disguise itself as warmth. Daniel said nothing. He looked at his water glass. I sat with that for exactly 4 seconds. Then I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, said I hoped everyone enjoyed the rest of their evening, and left. I didn't cry on the drive home. I'd stopped doing that somewhere around my 45th year, the night a patient I'd cared for 3 weeks didn't make it past midnight. After that, I understood that grief needed to be precise or it would swallow you whole. So I drove home with the radio off and my hands steady on the wheel, and I let myself feel exactly what I felt, which was not sadness, it was clarity. The apartment I'd lived in for 22 years was on the 4th floor of a building I owned on the corner of Maple and 6th. It wasn't grand. One bedroom, a kitchen where two people could barely pass each other without turning sideways, a window that looked out over the parking lot of a dry cleaner. I could have lived anywhere. I chose here because it reminded me of what I was actually doing with my money, which was not spending it on myself. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one labeled simply, Properties. 14 addresses. Purchased between 1989 and 2021. Duplexes, a small apartment complex, 2 commercial units currently leased to a dental practice and a physical therapy office. Current combined valuation, as of my last appraisal, $18.3 million. None of my family knew. Daniel didn't know because I'd decided years ago when he was still a teenager that money given without understanding was money wasted. I wanted him to build his own foundation first, to know what it felt like to earn something. He'd done that. He was good at his work. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped valuing the earning and started valuing the appearance. And I wasn't sure anymore whether that was his choice or hers. I pulled out the lease agreement near the bottom of the folder. Hartwell House, 3 acres, Westchester County. Leased through Ridgemont Property Holdings, LLC. My initials, my company. My property. I purchased it in 2017 when the previous owners defaulted. A family that had overextended on renovations and couldn't sustain the carrying costs. The estate had been on the market for 11 months. Everyone said it was too expensive to maintain, too isolated, too much liability. I bought it for $2.1 million in cash through my LLC and leased it to a series of tenants through a property management company I trusted to keep the arrangement quiet. Vivienne had found it through a luxury rental agency 18 months ago. She'd chosen it because it had the right kind of name, the right kind of driveway, the right kind of impression on people who needed impressing. She'd never asked who owned it. People like Vivienne rarely did. They assumed that beautiful things belonged to other people like them. She'd been hosting Thanksgiving dinner in my house. I closed the folder and sat in the quiet for a long time. Outside, the dry cleaner's sign clicked off at 9 o'clock, same as every night. The building's boiler hummed in the basement. Upstairs, my tenant, Mrs. Okafor, was watching television, the low murmur of it coming through the ceiling like a heartbeat. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. Patricia Hale had been my lawyer for 19 years. She was in her late 50s, sharp, unhurried, and had the kind of memory that made opposing counsel visibly nervous. When I told her what I needed, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "Come in first thing tomorrow. We need to do this correctly." Patricia's office was in a brownstone 3 blocks from my building. She had 2 associates and a receptionist named James who always offered coffee before you'd finished sitting down. I arrived at 8:30 with the lease agreement, the LLC documentation, and a summary of what I'd decided. "I want to terminate the Hartwell lease at the end of the current period," I said. 60 days notice per the contract terms. Patricia looked at the paperwork. "The lease renews in 6 weeks. You're within your rights." She looked up. "Is this about what happened?" "It's about what's been happening," I said. "Vivienne's name isn't on the lease. Daniel's isn't either. It's held by a corporate tenant, a hospitality LLC they use for client entertainment purposes. The LLC is real, but it's one of her father's shells. He's been having his own financial difficulties." "How do you know that?" "Because I had someone look." I slid a second folder across her desk. "Gerald Ashworth, Vivienne's father. He's carried significant debt since 2020. The Hospitality LLC is one of 4 he operates. 2 of the others have outstanding judgments. He can't cover another lease commitment." Patricia reviewed the documents. "If you terminate, they lose the property. They lose the lease," I said. "The property has always been mine." She nodded slowly. "And Daniel?" I thought about my son sitting at the head of that table, looking at his water glass while his wife laughed at my gift. I thought about the boy who used to call me from college at 11 at night just to talk, who had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm because I'd mentioned my boiler wasn't working right, who had become someone I didn't recognize at his own dinner table. "Daniel will be fine," I said, "but he needs to see something clearly before that can happen." Patricia sent the termination notice through proper channels on a Monday. By Wednesday evening, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "Mom, His voice was lower than usual, tighter. "I need to talk to you." "I'm listening." "Did you know? About the house?" I let the silence sit for a moment. "Did I know what?" "That you own it. The Hartwell property. Vivian's father just found out. He's been on the phone all day. Daniel paused. "He's saying you did this on purpose." "I purchased the Hartwell estate in 2017, I said. "Long before Vivian found it through the rental agency. I didn't arrange for her to lease it. That was a coincidence and not a pleasant one for anyone. So you're really—" He stopped. "You really own it, along with 13 other properties." The silence on his end lasted long enough that I counted it. 7 seconds. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to know who you were before you knew what I had." Another pause. "Shorter this time. We need to talk," he said. "Yes," I said, "we do. Come Sunday. I'll make dinner." He didn't come Sunday. He sent a text at noon saying Vivian wasn't feeling well and they'd need to reschedule. I read it once and put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I went to work that night. 12-hour rotation in the cardiac unit, the same floor I'd worked for 11 years. My colleague Rosario was already at the station when I arrived, updating charts with the focused calm she brought to everything. She was 58, had 3 grown children, and rented a 2-bedroom apartment 30 minutes away because that was what she could afford on a nurse's salary in Westchester County. "Rough week?" she asked, not looking up. "Interesting one," I said. She smiled at her chart. "I'll take interesting over boring. We worked through to 6 in the morning. I drove home as the sky went pale over the dry cleaner's parking lot, changed out of my scrubs, and sat at the kitchen table with my folder again. I had already decided what to do with the Hartwell property when the lease terminated. The 3 acres sat adjacent to a corridor of land the county had been trying to develop for workforce housing for 6 years without success. The zoning was complex, the acquisition costs high, and private developers kept walking away when they ran the numbers. I'd been in conversation with a county housing administrator named Elaine Marsh for 8 months. She'd called me twice to say the project was stalling. I'd told her both times to be patient. Now I called her back. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "I was hoping to hear from you. The Hartwell property will be available in 60 days. I'd like to move forward with the workforce housing conversion. 48 units, mixed income, priority placement for essential workers. Teachers, nurses, first responders." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the piece we've been missing. That acreage ties the whole corridor together." "I know," I said. "I've known for a while. I just needed the timing to be right." We worked out the preliminary framework over the next 2 hours. Elaine would handle the county coordination and permitting. I would contribute the property at below market value and fund the initial construction phase through the LLC. A nonprofit housing organization I'd supported for years would manage tenant placement and long-term operations. When I hung up, the building's boiler had gone quiet. Somewhere above me, Mrs. O'Coffer was starting her morning. I could hear her kettle, the small domestic sounds of a woman beginning her day in a home she could afford because I'd kept this building's rent stable for 2 decades, absorbing costs other landlords passed along. Because I believed that the people who kept a community running deserved to live in it. I believed that with everything I had. 3 weeks after the termination notice, Daniel came alone. He knocked at 7, earlier than I'd expected. I opened the door and looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time and longer than I wanted to admit. He was thinner. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas. He was holding a paper bag with 2 containers of soup from the deli on 5th Street, the one we used to walk to together when he was in high school. He remembered. "Come in," I said. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair he'd always used, the one closer to the window. I got out bowls and we sat across from each other, and for a few minutes we just ate and didn't say anything, and it felt almost normal, which was the most complicated thing either of us had offered each other in 2 years. Then he set down his spoon. "She told me you were doing this to punish us," he said, "that you found out about the property somehow and waited for the right moment." "What do you think?" I asked. I think he stopped. "I think I sat at that table and didn't say anything when she laughed at your gift. And I've been thinking about that since the night it happened." That's a start. He looked at me. How long have you owned it? The Hartwell property? Since 2017. He calculated. We got married in 2022. We moved in 2 years ago. Yes. So for almost 2 years, Vivian has been hosting dinners and holiday parties and impressing her parents in a house that belongs to you. He said it without drama. Just the fact of it, sitting between us. Her father's LLC has been paying my property management company's invoice every month, I said. The management company is a separate entity. Nothing in the lease connected back to me directly. It was a coincidence that she found it, Daniel. But it wasn't a coincidence that I kept quiet. Why? Because I needed to see who she was. And I needed to see who she was. And I needed to see who you were becoming. He looked at the table. I haven't been great. No, I said gently. You haven't. The soup was getting cold. Neither of us moved to warm it. I've been trying to hold 2 things together, he said. You and her. And every time I try, one of them slips. You can't hold 2 things together when one of them requires you to let go of yourself, I said. I've watched you disappear, Daniel. I've watched you become someone who stays quiet at tables when his mother is being laughed at. His jaw tightened. That's not the man I raised, I said. And I don't think it's the man you want to be. The silence stretched long enough that the refrigerator cycled on and then off again. She's not entirely wrong, he finally said. I have wanted things to look a certain way. The house, the dinners, the life we put together. Part of that was mine, not just hers. I know. But after Thanksgiving, he paused. After I saw your face when you walked out, I started to understand the difference between the life we were performing and the life we were actually living. And what did you find when you looked? He met my eyes. Not much I was proud of. I stood and took both bowls to the sink. Behind me, I heard him exhale. What happens to the house? He asked. In 60 days, the lease terminates and I begin a conversion. 48 units of workforce housing. Priority for essential workers, nurses, teachers, people like Rosario. He was quiet. The county has been trying to make this project work for years, I said. The Hartwell acreage ties the whole corridor together. The right use for the right land at the right time. You've been planning this. I've been waiting for the timing, I said. There's a difference. I turned around and leaned against the sink and looked at my son. Daniel, I have 14 properties and $18 million in assets, and I have lived in this apartment for 22 years because the money was never the point. The point was what you did with the work, what you built, what you left behind that mattered. He nodded slowly. I wanted you to understand that before you knew about any of it, I said. I wanted you to build your own foundation and know what earning something felt like. You did that. Your firm, your work. That's yours, and I'm proud of it. But somewhere along the way, you started mistaking appearance for achievement, and that's a much more dangerous problem. He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below. After a moment, he said, She's not going to take this well. I know. Her family is going to lose the house. Her father's LLC is going to lose the lease, I said. The distinction matters. He turned. Are you going to tell me what to do? No. That's not what this is. Then what is it? I crossed the kitchen and stood beside him at the window. Below, the dry cleaner's day shift was arriving, 2 women in blue uniforms pulling their bags from a car that had seen better decades. It's an invitation, I said, to decide who you want to be when no one's watching, when there's nothing to perform for, when it's just the work and the choice. He was quiet for a long time. I want to come back, he finally said. Not to anything specific, just back. Then come back, I said. There's a property management review every first Monday. I'd like a second set of eyes on the workforce housing proposal before I finalize the construction timeline. He looked at me. You're offering me work. I'm offering you something real to do. Whether you show up is your choice. He nodded. His shoulders settled in a way they hadn't in 2 years. I'll be there, he said. Monday. He was. He arrived at 8:50 with coffee for both of us and a copy of the county zoning documents he downloaded and reviewed the night before. He had notes in the margins. Good notes. The kind that came from actually reading something. We worked for 3 hours at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd sat as a teenager doing homework while I made dinner between shifts. He asked good questions. He understood spatial planning in a way that was useful, and twice he caught details in the construction timeline that would have created delays I hadn't anticipated. I didn't tell him how much I valued that. I just worked through it with him and let the morning be what it was. Vivienne called his phone twice during that meeting. He silenced it both times without looking at the screen. Over the next 6 weeks, he came every Monday. Then he started coming Thursdays as well, to drive the properties with me, to meet the tenants, to understand what I'd actually built over 34 years. I introduced him to Mrs. Okafor, who'd lived in my building for 16 years and still brought me soup when she heard me coughing. I introduced him to the Ramrise family on the second floor, who paid their rent on the first of every month without exception, and whose daughter had just been accepted to nursing school. I introduced him to Rosario, who met us at the site of the Hartwell property on a cold morning in January and walked the 3 acres with us while her breath made small clouds in the air. She's going to be one of the first applicants, I told Daniel as we walked the boundary of the future building site. She deserves a home she can actually afford, he said. Yes, I said, she does. He stopped and looked at the ground where the Hartwell house had stood, already partially cleared, the bones of the old structure giving way to the outline of something new. I kept thinking the house made us look successful, he said. I didn't think about what it actually cost. Everything costs something, I said. The question is whether what you're paying for is worth it. He nodded, eyes still on the cleared foundation. Vivienne and I are separating, he said. I wanted you to know. She's moving back to her parents. Her father's working something out with the other properties. I didn't say anything. I'd seen it coming for weeks, the way you see weather from a distance, not wishing it one way or the other, just reading what's already true. I'm sorry it went this way, I said finally. I don't think you are, he said without any bitterness, and I don't think I am either. That's probably the most honest thing I've said in 2 years. We walked back to the car and drove to the next property. The groundbreaking for Hartwell Heights' 48 units of workforce housing was held on a Saturday morning in April with a small group of county officials, future tenants, and construction partners. There was no podium. There was no ceremony to speak of. Elaine Marsh said a few words about the county's housing corridor goals. The construction foreman shook my hand. Rosario and 7 other nurses who had submitted early applications stood in a group near the fence line, some of them with their children, all of them with the quiet, specific hope of people who had spent years on a wait list for something they deserved and had almost stopped believing they'd get. I stood at the edge of the crowd with Daniel beside me. He had a clipboard. He'd been coordinating the site logistics for 2 months, donating his architectural expertise to the project without pay. He hadn't asked me to acknowledge it. He just showed up and did the work. The foreman gave the signal and the first machinery moved. Rosario caught my eye across the crowd and smiled. I nodded. Daniel looked at the ground being broken and said, quietly, more to himself than to me, "This is what it's for." "That's right," I said. We stood there while the machinery worked. The April sun was thin but real, the kind of light that promises something without overstating it. Somewhere behind us, Mrs. Prom, Okafor was telling one of the other future tenants about the dry cleaner on the corner, how you could leave things Tuesday morning and they'd be done by Thursday afternoon, how the neighborhood was quiet and safe, and the woman at the counter knew your name after the second visit. Building things, I'd learned over 34 years, was rarely about the grand moments. It was about the second visit, the Monday morning, the rent paid on the first, the 12-hour shift that turned into another 12-hour shift because the unit needed someone steady and you were the one who stayed. I had mopped no floors, I had emptied no trash cans, but I had worked the same night hours as the people who had, and I had understood that their labor was the foundation everything else rested on, and I had tried to build in a way that honored that, even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. My son stood beside me on a piece of land that had once been used to make people feel important and was now being rebuilt to give people something real. He'd gotten there the hard way. So had I. That was, in my experience, the only way that held. That evening I went home, changed out of my good shoes, and went to work. Night shift, Cardiac unit, same as always. Rosario was already at the station. She looked up when I came in. "Good day?" she asked. "A very good day," I said. She smiled and handed me the chart for the patient in room 7, and we got to work, the way we always had, the way we always would, because that was what we did, and there was nothing small about it, not to us, not anymore. Not to the 48 families who would soon have a home because 2 women had spent their careers showing up at midnight and understanding, bone deep, that the work itself was the point. I sat at the nurse's station just after 2 in the morning, the floor quiet around me, and thought about the envelope I brought to that Thanksgiving table. $4,000 and a phone number and a note about building something that lasted. Vivienne had called it nurse's pennies. She wasn't entirely wrong about the pennies. 34 years of them, set aside every month, turned into 14 properties and a workforce housing development, and a son who now showed up on Monday mornings with good questions and coffee for 2. That's what pennies do, if you know what they're for. And to you listening to this story, I want to say something plainly. Your labor has a value that no dinner table can determine. The people who walk past you, who speak over you, who smile at what you do and then turn away, they are reading the wrong ledger. What you build in the hours they don't see, in the shifts they've never worked, in the choices you make quietly and without applause, that is the actual record. That is what stands. I never needed my daughter-in-law to understand my worth. I needed my son to find his own. And I needed, if I'm honest, to stop waiting for permission to do what I'd known needed doing for years. The timing was never going to be perfect. It never is. You just decide what matters and you do the work. That's all it ever was. That's all it ever needed to be. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated because of what you do? Have you watched someone you love lose themselves trying to look like something they're not? Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their work is enough. Subscribe to Silver Revenge for more stories about women who built quietly and stood firm when it counted. Your time is valuable. Thank you for spending some of it here.